The rain hit the ambulance bay like 1,000 fast heartbeats, jittery and relentless, washing the sodium lights into smears of gold on black asphalt. A figure in a torn army jacket stumbled out of the shadows, one hand pressed to his ribs, the other cradling a small metal box against his chest. When he collapsed against the glass doors of St. Gabriel Medical Center, the thud echoed down the empty corridor like a gavel striking wood. In the 2 seconds before the doors slid open, Nurse Marissa Hale had already begun to run, because some alarms are older than policy, older than fear, and they're wired straight into the bones of people who are born to care. She reached him first, knees hitting wet concrete, palms on cold skin, mind-splitting and layering tasks the way only a trauma nurse can: airway, breathing, circulation, a glance at pupils, a skin for the quiet catastrophes that don't announce themselves with blood. He smelled of rain and diesel and the brittle sweetness of ketones, like a body running on the last fumes of its own reserves. His lips were blue-tinged, his pulse thread-like, his jacket soaked and heavy. The small metal box clanged softly as it slipped, and Marissa shoved it back beneath his arm with a reflex that felt oddly reverent, as if it were part of him that she had no right to touch. Security shouted that intake was on diversion, admin protocols, no beds, no budget for non-emergent indigent care after midnight. The word skittered across the wet floor and died without reaching her. She called for a wheelchair, then a gurney, then gave up on both and hooked her hands under his shoulders, whispering a promise she couldn't afford to break. She would not let him die in a doorway. Inside, fluorescent light carved every flaw from the walls and every fatigue line from her face, but it also gave shape to hope. She pulled warm blankets from the cabinet with the furious tenderness of someone making a bed for grief and decided against waiting for permission. IV access on the second try, warm saline flowing, fingers checking the sternum abrasion beneath that jacket where a blunt force had kissed bone. His breath rattled with a wet friction that didn't belong to lungs built for broad shoulders and miles walked. A chest x-ray would need to tell its version of the truth, but until then she built him a bridge of small mercies: heat for the cold blood, glucose for the starving cells, oxygen for the tired heart. The night resident hesitated, eyes lifted toward the cameras, the imaginary weight of a spreadsheet heavier than any patient. Marissa nodded once, a clipped, lethal kindness, and the resident signed orders, as if reaching for the edge of a cliff and choosing not to fall. The homeless man did not speak, but the body speaks old languages. His hands were clean in the way that belongs to people who have made a habit of washing where no faucets exist, a discipline that suggested former routines and a now ruined pride. A scar traced an old sternotomy, pale and definitive, the kind carved by someone who once opened his chest and closed it with the same gravity that ends a prayer. Pinned inside the army jacket she found a hospital bracelet with no barcode, only an embossed crest to crossing serpents around a torch, a private clinic's emblem that belonged to a world of white marble and private elevators. The metal box under his arm was locked, its edges worn by use, its smooth top etched with the same crest, as if identity were a circle he kept tracing even as the rest of him unraveled. Marissa slid it under the bed as if placing a relic at an altar and kept working the algorithm that matters when clocks are louder than hearts. When the administrator arrived, the air temperature seemed to drop in defiance of the warm blankets. Deborah Cole's heels sounded like judgments across tile, precise and inarguable, and her mouth held the kind of smile that managers wear when the board is watching. She asked questions that pretended to be neutral: who authorized admission, who broke diversion, who would explain the cost center variance, while the man's pulse found a rhythm that didn't belong to numbers on a page. Marissa answered without stopping her hands, because a nurse's true voice is measured in actions per minute, because you cannot reason with a fire while a house is still burning. When Deborah asked again, slower and louder, the resident tried to speak and failed, and somehow the failure folded across the room and settled on Marissa's shoulders. It was not the first time she had carried blame like a patient, carefully and with her name on the chart. The firing happened in a conference room that smelled faintly of coffee and fruit that had given up pretending to be fresh. Words like precedent and misuse and unsustainable were used with surgical precision, slicing her history into irrelevance and cauterizing the parts that might have bled. Marissa listened as if from a distance, as if the rain outside was playing a second story just for her, the one where a human being had been dying on a threshold, and she had chosen to drag him across it because lines are for paper, not for nights that arrive with cold teeth. She signed papers she did not read and hung her badge on a hook that would not remember her name by morning. On the way back to the unit, she paused at the glass and watched the man's chest rise under the blanket. The rise was small and stubborn, the way weeds push through concrete. She wondered if her choice would survive the daylight. In the bed, the man stirred for the first time and opened his eyes like someone remembering light. The irises were an unsettled gray, storm water, with a bit of broken coin at the center, and when they landed on Morris's face they did not flinch. She leaned close, told him he was safe, told him he was warm, told him his body had been given a second chance to try. He blinked slowly, as if his mind were a room he had re-entered after a long absence, and then his hand moved toward the metal box with a speed that startled the heart monitor into a tiny electric panic. He fumbled at the latch that wasn't there, and tears formed not of pain, but of something that resembled shame, which is the heaviest liquid on earth when it spills in a hospital room. Marissa placed her hand over his, steady and deliberate, and for a long breath they were 2 points on a line that refused to break. The storm outside made the city stutter, and the hospital's backup power hummed like a low hymn. Somewhere, a television in the waiting room ran a loop segment about a philanthropic gala gone wrong, a famous family who hadn't arrived, a helicopter that had deviated from its flight plan in the previous week's fog. The shot lingered on a crest, silver on navy, to serpents around a torch, stitched into the napkins and pinned on lapels. The newscaster's voice mentioned an heir who had vanished from the public eye 2 years ago. Whispers of a breakdown, rumors of rehab, the sort of gossip that eats men alive while they are still trying to breathe. Marissa didn't hear it then. She only heard the susurrus of heated air, the soft click of the four-pump, the quiet the body makes when it decides to live anyway. By dawn, the rain settled into a mournful drizzle, and the hospital traded night secrecy for day's accounting. Deborah Cole drafted an email that sanded the splinters off the story, stripped it to policy points and personnel updates, and signed it with the permanent neatness of someone who will never understand the messiness of grace. Marissa collected the last of her things in a small box that did not deserve the weight of her career. The box felt light in her arms and heavy everywhere else. She took one last detour past the room where the man slept and thought about kindness as a profession and as a rebellion. He lay there like a question waiting for its verb, and she wanted to answer it with her entire life, but life was already moving on without her badge to open doors. On her way out, a security guard hustled down the hall with a stack of printed photos that looked too glossy for grief. He taped one outside the nurse's station at eye level, the image of a younger man standing with a woman in a gown that looked like frost. The caption begged the public for information and framed the photo in reward money that would change any ordinary person's year. The crest at the bottom was the same as the one etched into the metal box under the bed, the same as the bracelet without a barcode, the same as the emblem stitched into 1,000 expensive secrets. Somewhere in the hospital, a television changed its headline, moved from gossip to breaking news, and then to a single sentence that would travel like a spark through dry grass and find its way to the one room where the stormwater eyes had finally closed in rest. The sentence would tear open everything, but in that moment, the city held its breath and the door hissed shut behind Nurse Marissa Hale, who had done the right thing a few hours too early for the world to call it right. The city woke beneath the dull gray hum of morning, but inside St. Gabriel, the storm had only changed shape. The news spread through corridors like electricity through thin wires. A nurse fired overnight for breaking protocol, a nameless vagrant admitted without authorization. Whispers fed on half-truths and moral fatigue, leaving behind the bitter aftertaste of judgment. Marissa Hale sat alone in the locker room, her uniform folded with military precision, her ID badge turned face down as if it had shamed itself. Every nurse knows the difference between a clean cut and one that festers. This wound would not heal quickly. In the trauma unit, the man she had carried through the rain drifted in and out of a fog dense enough to hide years. He remembered fragments, the rhythm of rotors, the scent of metal and aviation fuel, a woman's laugh cracking like glass. His dreams spooled in reverse, showing him a life wrapped in silk and champagne that now felt fictional. When he awoke, the ceiling light stabbed his pupils, and the ache in his ribs sang like an old scar tuning itself. He reached instinctively for the small metal box, found it under the blanket, and pressed it to his chest with the reflex of a soldier guarding something sacred. Marissa couldn't stop herself from returning, even without clearance. The door's tiny window framed her like a guilty conscience, one eye on the monitor, one on him. His color had improved, the ashen hue replaced by the faintest blush of life. She entered quietly, as if stepping into a chapel, her shoes leaving wet ghosts on the linoleum. The air smelled of antiseptic and redemption. She checked his forehead with hands that remembered every vein they had ever saved, then placed a cup of water on the tray, though she had no right to be there anymore. He watched her in silence, his gaze sharpened by the kind of gratitude that makes people tremble. His voice was hoarse, a rough gravel dragged across memory. He asked her name, not like a question, but like a vow. She told him softly, Marissa, and it felt like confession. He tried to tell her his, but the words cracked, useless. When she asked if he had family, he nodded once, then looked away toward the window, where sunlight fought its way through clouds. She noticed how his wrist bore the faint tan line of a luxury watch long removed, and how his hands, though calloused now, had the muscle memory of signing checks, not begging for change. As the monitors blinked their steady hymn, Marissa felt the pull of something larger than protocol, that invisible current that runs beneath every act of mercy, the one that demands you see what others refuse to look at. The world outside could call it foolishness, insubordination, weakness. But she knew better, it was the pulse of purpose itself. When she left his room, she slipped her badge back into her pocket. Fired or not, she wasn't done with this man, or the truth that had followed him into her life like rain that refuses to stop falling. The hospital's corridors hummed with the hollow music of routine, the kind that hides everything extraordinary behind fluorescent sameness. But that morning, the atmosphere trembled slightly, like a string stretched too tight. News had begun leaking from the nurse's station to the doctor's lounge. The homeless man from last night wasn't what he seemed. A lab technician whispered about DNA requests coming from higher up, and the head of security had been summoned by someone whose title required no introduction. By noon, everyone sensed the strange gravity of a secret being born. Marissa tried to keep her distance, but distance was an illusion. When she walked past the trauma wing, she could feel his presence in the rhythm of the monitors, as if the machines themselves remembered her hands. Guilt and defiance tangled inside her. She had saved his life, and yet she had lost hers. But it wasn't just guilt that drew her back, it was the box. The small metal case that had lain beneath his arm, silent as a confession. She had seen things locked away before, patients who carried grief like smuggled goods, but this was different. The crest engraved on the lid had haunted her dreams. Two serpents around a torch, the same emblem from last night's news broadcast about the missing heir. In the early afternoon, while the day shift pulsed with its usual chaos, Marissa returned under the pretense of collecting personal items from her locker. Her steps were measured, her heart anything but. She waited until the hallway thinned, then slipped into his room. The man was sleeping again, his breath even but shallow. The metal box sat on the side table, still closed, still patient. She hesitated only once before reaching for it. Nurses are trained to read vital signs, but sometimes the body of truth has its own pulse, its own warning. The latch was cold beneath her fingertips. It wasn't locked after all, just sealed by fear and intent. Inside, beneath layers of folded paper and a water-damaged photograph, she found a badge. Not a hospital ID, but a private insignia with his name etched in elegant serif letters. Elias Mercer, heir to the Mercer Foundation, one of the wealthiest medical philanthropy groups in the country. The kind that own research hospitals and entire wings of this very building. Beneath the badge was a handwritten note, the ink blurred but legible enough to sting. If I disappear, it's because I finally saw what they're doing. Don't trust anyone wearing this crest. Marissa froze. Her lungs tightened until the room shrank around her. This wasn't just a man fallen from grace, this was someone running from it. She looked at his sleeping face, the faint scars, the exhaustion, and realized he hadn't been lost. He had been hiding, from them, from this place. From whatever the Mercer Foundation had buried under its glossy image of benevolence. A wave of nausea hit her as she imagined the headlines, the hospital's panic, her own role in a story that might devour her if she let it. The door creaked open behind her, and she turned so fast the box clattered to the floor. A shadow crossed the threshold, the head administrator, Deborah Cole, her face composed but her eyes too alert. For a moment, neither spoke. Deborah's gaze slid from Marissa to the box, then back, a small smile ghosting her lips like the edge of a blade. She stepped inside and closed the door with quiet finality. The fluorescent lights hummed louder, And outside, the last of the morning rain began again, thin and cold, like the world itself taking a sharp breath. For a heartbeat, silence ruled the room. The air seemed to solidify between them, two women standing on opposite sides of a secret neither fully controlled. Deborah's heels clicked once against the tile as she advanced, her expression carved from the same polished steel as the hospital's elevators. Marissa didn't move. The open metal box lay between them, its contents exposed under the sterile light, the Mercer crest gleaming like an accusation. Deborah crouched, picked up the badge without hesitation, and turned it over in her manicured hand. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" she asked, her voice almost tender, the kind of tone predators used to make prey stay still. Marissa wanted to speak, but the words tangled in her throat. She had seen fear before, in parents waiting for diagnoses, in patients gripping bed rails, but this was different. This fear had paperwork, signatures, and lawyers behind it. Deborah slid the badge back into the box and closed the lid slowly, as if sealing a coffin. "Elias Mercer," she said softly. "I wondered when the ghosts would start returning." Then, with a smile to calm for the tension in the air, she added, "You have no idea who you brought into this hospital, do you?" Marissa swallowed hard. "I know who I saved," she said finally, her voice quiet but steady. "And I'd do it again." The words sounded braver than she felt. Deborah stood, brushing invisible dust from her sleeve. "You misunderstand," she said. "You didn't save him, you exposed him. And if you think this is a fairy tale where the nurse is the hero, you're more naive than I thought." She moved closer, close enough for Marissa to smell the faint trace of expensive perfume, something sharp, citrus and smoke. "Elias Mercer disappeared 2 years ago, after an internal audit at his foundation went missing, billions in unaccounted research funds. His own father buried the investigation, and now, thanks to your impulse, every reporter in the city is already circling this place like vultures." Deborah's voice dropped to a whisper. "The board will protect its own, not you. So here's what you're going to do. You're going to forget this box, this man, this night. You're going to walk away before someone decides you were part of his story." Marissa looked at Elias, still sleeping, his face softened by exhaustion, unaware that his name had returned from the dead. Something in her chest rebelled against the order. It wasn't just moral stubbornness, it was instinct, that raw, inexplicable human drive to fight for truth even when it destroys you. "You can fire me," she said, her voice trembling but fierce, "but you can't ask me to unsee what I saw." Deborah's eyes hardened. "I can do worse than fire you," she replied, and turned to leave. The door closed with a soft click that felt louder than thunder. Marissa stood motionless, pulse pounding in her ears. Outside, the hospital seemed to exhale, a long, low breath of fluorescent indifference. She placed the box back beneath the blanket and sat beside the bed for a moment, her hand hovering above Elias's wrist, feeling the faint rhythm of his pulse. It was the only honest sound in a building full of lies, and she knew then, whatever had started as an act of compassion had become something else entirely, a collision with a truth too big to stay buried. When Elias stirred minutes later, his eyes flickered open, meeting hers with fragile recognition. "You found it," he murmured weakly. "Don't let them." His breath hitched, and the monitor beeped in protest. Marissa leaned closer, her heart hammering. "Don't let them what, Elias?" But he slipped back into unconsciousness before the sentence could finish. She stared at him, realizing the storm from last night had only been the beginning. The real tempest was just waking up, and it lived within these hospital walls. Night returned to St. Gabriel with the quiet cruelty of routine, pretending nothing had changed while everything inside its walls was unraveling. The storm had moved offshore, but its echo lingered in the air vents, a constant hum like the low growl of something waiting to strike. Marissa stood in the hospital's parking lot, her breath fogging the glass of her car window as she debated driving away for good. Yet the thought of leaving Elias alone, sleep under the same crest that had destroyed him, gnawed at her until stillness became unbearable. Compassion had already cost her her job. Now it demanded her peace too. Inside, the corridors had taken on a different rhythm. Security guards were posted at every exit, their radios whispering codes she didn't recognize. A new badge system had been activated, locking down entire wings. Officially, it was for safety. Unofficially, it was for silence. The name Elias Mercer had resurfaced in the news hours earlier. His family's foundation released a carefully worded statement. We have been informed of an individual found under the name Elias Mercer. We await confirmation of identity. It sounded sterile, but beneath it lay panic. Marissa used the back entrance, slipping through like a shadow of her former self. The air smelled of bleach and fear. When she reached the trauma wing, his door was guarded. She waited until the nurse on duty, a friend, someone who had once borrowed her stethoscope and never returned it, turned her back. With a nod, the door opened just enough for Marissa to slip inside. Elias was awake this time, his eyes open and clear, though exhaustion still gripped him like chains. He looked at her as if she were the last real thing in a collapsing world. You shouldn't be here, he rasped. His voice was stronger now, low and rough-edged. Marissa crossed the room, ignoring the warning. Neither should you, she whispered. But here we are. She sat beside him, and for a while neither spoke. The monitors hummed softly, sensing with the slow rise and fall of his chest. Finally, Elias turned his head toward her. They think I stole it, he said. They think I ran because of money. But I ran because I found what they were doing with it. His hand trembled as he reached for the metal box, still resting beneath the blanket. Research funds, experimental trials, they weren't saving lives, they were trading them. The foundation, the board, even this hospital, they used the poor as test subjects, erased the records, but the silence of anyone who tried to stop them. His voice cracked. I was supposed to inherit their empire. Instead, I became their loose end. Marissa's pulse quickened, the floor beneath her seeming to shift. She had seen the way hospitals bury things, not under dirt, but under paperwork. Why come back here? She asked. If you knew they'd find you. Elias smiled faintly, a tired ghost of a man who had already run out of places to hide. Because I didn't want to die in the street with the truth locked in that box. He looked at her, eyes gray as stormlight. I needed someone who still believed saving a life meant something. The words hit her like a pulse of heat through ice. She realized then that what had felt like chance, her being on duty, the storm, his collapse, was something far stranger. A convergence. She had been meant to find him. Not for the foundation, not for the headlines, but because the world still needed witnesses. Someone to carry what the powerful wanted buried. The door handle rattled suddenly. Marissa rose instinctively, hiding the box behind the bed. The door opened, and two men in dark suits stepped inside. Their presence carried the chill of authority, polite voices, predatory calm. Miss Hale, one said, smiling without warmth. We'll take it from here. Elias's eyes widened, fear breaking through his composure. Marissa moved closer to him, her voice trembling but clear. He's my patient, she said. You can't. But the man's tone cut her like a scalpel. He's not your patient, Miss Hale. He's property. The words froze her blood. Property. A man reduced to an asset by the same institution that claimed to heal. And in that instant, she understood. This was never about a nurse breaking protocol. It was about silencing the one person who had seen behind the curtain. Elias gripped her hand. His voice dropped to a whisper. Don't let them have it, whatever happens. The men stepped forward. The room seemed to shrink around them, lights flickering like nervous hearts. Marissa's mind raced, choices blooming and dying in a single heartbeat. The box was hidden, but not for long. If she stayed, she would lose everything left of her life. If she ran, she might lose him. But compassion, once awakened, doesn't sleep again. She chose to run. The forest was alive with sound, wind dragging through leaves, rain whispering across branches, and somewhere in the distance, engines growling like predators that refused to rest. Marissa crouched in the dark hollow beneath the rocky ledge, her hands trembling around the metal box. Her clothes clung to her skin, cold and soaked, the smell of earth and fear thick in the air. Every breath she took came out in shivers. She knew she couldn't stay there long. Dawn would expose everything, and men like those didn't give up at sunrise, they just changed tactics. She brushed the mud from the box and held it up toward the dim flash of lightning. The Mercer crest gleamed faintly through the rain, two serpents and a torch, symbols of knowledge and healing, twisted now into an emblem of power and secrecy. She thought of Elias's voice, broken and raw, saying, Don't let them have it. His eyes had carried the exhaustion of someone who had seen too much truth to ever close them again. She opened the box slowly, her hand steadying against instinct. Inside, the papers were dry, Double-layered metal had saved them from the storm. At first, she couldn't make sense of the documents, ledgers, invoices, clinical trial forms, but as she read, her stomach turned. The Foundation's signature appeared over and over, beside terms like non-consented subject data and unrecorded mortality outcomes. There were photos, too, patients who had trusted the hospital, people from the city's shelters, faces she recognized from the names that had vanished quietly from the system, their bodies unclaimed, their records sealed. The ink blurred under the rain dripping from her hair, but the truth had already burned itself into her mind. A twig snapped behind her. Marissa froze, clutching the box to her chest. Through the curtain of rain, she could make out a figure moving between the trees, tall, deliberate steps, not the frantic movement of someone lost. She crawled backward until her spine met cold stone. Her heart hammered so loud she was certain it would give her away. The silhouette drew closer, light from a flashlight cutting through the branches. She saw the glint of metal, a gun, maybe, and the dark fabric of a suit, soaked but unmistakable. They had found her. But then, another sound cut through the storm, a distant cough, labored and human. Marissa turned, disbelieving. From deeper in the woods, another figure emerged, stumbling and bent but unmistakably real. Elias. His hospital gown was torn, his feet bare and bleeding, his face pale but alive. He must have escaped through the service tunnels, the same ones maintenance crews used during floods. His breath came ragged, his voice nearly lost to the rain. "You shouldn't have come back for me," he said, barely audible. She ran to him, catching his arm as he swayed. "You left me no choice," she whispered. "They're coming." He smiled faintly, a broken crescent of gratitude and despair. "Then it's time they heard what they built." He pointed toward the box. "That's not just evidence, Marissa. It's proof they killed people, hundreds. We can't hide it. We have to show it." The flashlight beam swept over them, and for an instant, the forest was lit like a stage. One of the men shouted, his voice sharp and metallic. Elias turned to her, eyes clear for the first time since she met him. "Run," he said. "Get it out, don't look back." Before she could answer, he shoved her away, turning toward the approaching light. The last thing she saw was his silhouette framed in lightning, standing tall despite the tremor in his legs, facing the men who had once called him property. She stumbled backward into the darkness, clutching the box, her heart breaking with every step. The rain grew louder, thunder folding over itself like applause for tragedy. Then, a gunshot, and another. The forest swallowed the sound, but the echo followed her long after she had stopped running. Marissa didn't know how long she ran before her knees gave out, before exhaustion claimed her. When she finally collapsed beside the old road leading out of the hospital grounds, dawn had begun to seep into the clouds, painting the world in cold silver. She opened the box one last time and looked at the faces on the pages, all the forgotten lives the system had erased. She whispered to them, voice trembling, "I'll tell them your names, all of them." And with the storm fading behind her, she started walking toward the city, barefoot, bleeding, but alive, carrying in her arms the one thing the powerful could never bury forever, the truth. Morning broke with the indifferent stillness that follows every storm. The city seemed cleaner, quieter, as if pretending nothing had happened, but beneath that calm, something new had begun to stir. Marissa walked along the service road barefoot, her hospital scrubs torn and her hair heavy with rain. In her arms, the metal box gleamed weakly in the rising light, its surface streaked with mud and fingerprints, her only proof that the night had been real. Each step sent a dull ache through her body, but she kept walking, because stopping would mean surrender. And she had already given up everything except her conviction. By the time she reached the outskirts of the city, her legs trembled from exhaustion. She found a small cafe just opening for the morning rush, its neon sign flickering half awake. The woman behind the counter froze when she saw Marissa, soaked, pale, and trembling. "Do you need a hospital?" she asked softly. Marissa almost laughed. "No," she said. "I just left one." She asked for a phone, her voice hoarse from silence. While the woman fetched it, Marissa stared at the television hanging above the counter. The morning news was playing. A familiar image filled the screen, Elias Mercer's face, taken years earlier, before his disappearance. The anchor's voice was calm, rehearsed. "Breaking this morning. The missing heir of the Mercer Foundation has been found deceased near the St. Gabriel Medical Center." Authorities are investigating what appears to be an altercation in the hospital's forest perimeter. Sources say an unidentified nurse may have been involved. Morris's hands shook so violently she nearly dropped the phone. Involved. The word twisted like wire around her throat. She dialed the only number she could trust, not a friend, not family, but a journalist she once met during a patient advocacy rally. A woman who had spent years exposing malpractice cases and hospital corruption. The line rang, once, twice. Then a voice, "This is Dana." Marissa didn't waste time. "My name is Marissa Hale. I have documents from the Mercer Foundation, proof of illegal human trials, patient deaths, falsified research. And I know who they killed to hide it." Silence on the other end, then Dana's voice dropped to a whisper. "Where are you?" An hour later, Marissa sat in the back booth of a quiet diner across town, her hands wrapped around a mug of black coffee she couldn't taste. The journalist arrived, sharp eyes, raincoat still dripping, and slid into the seat opposite her. Marissa placed the box on the table. "Everything's inside," she said. "If anything happens to me, you make it public." Dana opened the lid, her eyes widening as she flipped through the papers. This could take down half the board of trustees," she murmured. "Do you understand what they'll do to you if they know you're still alive?" Marissa nodded slowly. "I'm not hiding anymore. I just want the truth to outlive me." Hours later, as Dana left with the evidence, Marissa watched through the diner window as sunlight broke through the clouds for the first time in days. The light spilled across the wet pavement like mercy, blinding and soft. She thought of Elias, his voice, his eyes, the way he'd stood against them even in the end. Maybe justice wasn't a single moment of victory. Maybe it was this, carrying the weight until someone else could lift it higher. That night, every major network broke the story. Hidden trials, falsified data, corruption inside one of the most powerful medical institutions in the country. The Mercer Foundation collapsed under the weight of its own secrets. Deborah Cole resigned for health reasons. Anonymous whistleblowers came forward. And though no one ever mentioned Marissa Hale by name, an uncredited photograph began circulating online, a blurry still from a security camera, a nurse in soaked scrubs running through the rain, holding a small metal box to her chest. In that image, the internet saw a story it could understand: sacrifice, courage, defiance. But only Marissa knew the truth, that the real hero had fallen beneath the trees, refusing to run so that she could live long enough to speak. She carried his memory like a heartbeat, quiet but unyielding, the echo of compassion that no system could erase. Weeks later, she stood at the edge of the city park, where the Stormwater River met the sea. The rain had returned, gentle now, almost cleansing. She whispered his name once into the wind, not as grief, but as promise. Then she turned away, walking toward the lights of the city, where truth, at last, had found a voice. And somewhere in the quiet distance, thunder rolled again, not as warning this time, but as applause.